Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on Reimagining Nuclear Arms Control, and to welcome Dr. James Acton and Dr. Tom MacDonald from the Carnegie Endowment. Let me just say a few words by way of introduction. It's become a common shorthand to say that arms control must adapt or die. And then it must adapt to the more multipolar nature of the security environment and to the more multi-domain character of strategic stability and strategic relationships. And this is more easily said than done, of course, adapting to significantly different security environment and context. But some of the very best thinking on this challenge has been done at the Carnegie Endowment. For those of you who don't know the Carnegie Endowment Nuclear Policy Program, let me just say that it weathered the long interregnum of low interest in this subject and has grown a very substantial body of important and timely and thoughtful work. That work currently spans this work on arms control and some related arms control work, a cluster of activities on U.S. nuclear policy, some of the best recommendations to the Biden administration on its NPR emanated from Carnegie. It's done some important work on nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, on renovating the nuclear order, and James in particular has led some important work on entanglement, conventional nuclear entanglement, and the risks of inadvertent escalation. So this is an impressive track record of work, and we're very grateful that to have one of the co-directors of the program with us today, Dr. James Acton, and one of the fellows in the program, Tom MacDonald, to talk about a recent report of theirs on reimagining nuclear arms control. Just to complete the introductions, James is a co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program and holds the Jessica Matthews Chair at Carnegie Endowment, a chair named after a former director of the endowment. He is well known to our community. He's been a frequent participant in activities of the center and has previously delivered lectures in this series. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from Cambridge University. And Tom MacDonald's a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie. His research interests include arms control verification and the impact of remote sensing and emerging and disruptive technologies on nuclear stability. And he has a PhD in nuclear science and engineering from MIT. I think the two of you are prepared to go for roughly 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. As usual, I will try to favor those who could put their electronic hands up to join the conversation personally. But if you'd prefer to put something in the chat function, I'll ensure that it gets into play before we run out of time. So thanks very much to the two of you for carving out the time to join us today. Thanks for your good work on these issues. Over to you.
Brad, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I should say I always learn a lot from giving talks at Livermore. I've had the opportunity to do that a few times. It's always a great pleasure, and the questions are always deeply informative and useful, as is indeed the work of the Center for Global Security Research at Livermore and all the great work that you're doing there, Brad. As Brad mentioned, we've recently completed some work at Carnegie on the future of nuclear arms control, thinking about how to adapt it, how to reimagine it for the contemporary security environment. So that's the piece of work that I want to present today. And let me start here by talking a little bit about the security environments and the dangers that we're trying to mitigate using arms control. I use that word mitigate because I don't think arms control can necessarily solve these dangers, but I think it has an important potential role to play in mitigating and reducing these dangers. So firstly, I think we are seeing the emergence of simultaneous arms races between the United States and Russia on one hand, and the United States on China on the other hand. These arms races involve developments in both strategic and non-strategic nuclear forces. I use the term here strategic in the kind of, I think, somewhat unhelpful Cold War sense of meaning nuclear weapons that can reach from one state's homeland or from SSBNs to the other state's homelands. As opposed to any description of effect of the weapon. But as I said, we see competition in both strategic and non-strategic nuclear forces. This competition has both qualitative and quantitative dimensions too. And in this kind of 2x2 matrix, this competition is not equally intense in all of these cells. With New START in place, there is no quantitative arms race in strategic forces with Russia. At least not much of one, though Russia is, of course, developing its new exotic capabilities. New START will only be in place till 2026. But, you know, overall, I think that we see the emergence of these twin arms races. There are a range of drivers to these arms races. I mean, I think they are driven to some extent by conventional imbalances between the US and Russia and between the US and China. And those conventional imbalances are changing. They are fluid. And that has implications for each state's security requirements as it sees them. We are seeing doctrinal innovation in terms of nuclear employment policy within the different states. I think China's development of its regional nuclear forces, for me at least, signifies quite significant change in Chinese thinking about the role of nuclear weapons. We have concerns about Russia's escalate to de-escalate doctrine. The US is innovating doctrine in terms of the low-yield D5 as a way of responding to that. There are concerns about the survivability of nuclear forces and their command and control systems. All three states, US, Russia, and China, have those concerns, even if they're not identical. And then we have what I describe as the ongoing demise of arms control. With the end of the INF treaty, as a result of Russian non-compliance, we now just have New START left in place. That only covers US and Russian strategic forces. It doesn't cover China. And that can only remain in force until 2026. We then have escalation risks. I think the Russian and Chinese concerns about the survivability of their nuclear forces has the potential to drive escalation in a crisis. And I think also the growing entanglement between the nuclear and non-nuclear domains has the potential to drive escalation. If you look at Russian and Chinese conventional warfighting strategy, I think they think very seriously about attacking US dual-use command and control assets. That is, command and control assets that are used for both nuclear and non-nuclear operations. And that, I think, has the potential to also drive escalation. Against this background, as I say, I think arms control has a role to play in mitigating these dangers. We define arms control broadly in the way that Schelling and Halperin originally did in their classic volume on the subject, as all the forms of military cooperation between potential adversaries. That certainly includes treaties that mandate reductions, but is not in any way limited to treaty-based reductions. Politically binding confidence and transparency building is arms control in the way that we understand it. Behavioral norms I would consider to be arms control, even if we don't focus on them particularly in this project. And the report that we set out, and then also a previous one that Pranay Vadi and I wrote back in October 2020, lay out between them 10 different ideas for arms control. I'm not going to go through all 10 now, but I want to kind of summarize these in 5 buckets. The first thing that Pranay and I proposed back in 2020 is that the US and Russia should negotiate a narrowly focused New START follow-on that focuses on strategic offensive arms, both nuclear and non-nuclear. This would include all of Russia's strategic systems, including its exotic systems, certain selected US non-nuclear systems, and any Russian non-nuclear systems that met those definitions. But we don't want to overload a New START follow-on and put so much on the table that it just collapses under, the negotiations collapse under their own weight. Instead, we propose that the issues that the US and Russia cannot deal with within the framework of a New START follow-on, they start working on with bilateral, non-binding confidence building and transparency measures. And we have a bunch of those related to non-strategic nuclear weapons, ballistic missile defense, and sea-based missiles. Engagement with China, we argue, should initially focus on fissile material, which we think is the most credible means of, and most straightforward, though still very difficult means of trying to get assurances that China's not going to build up its nuclear arsenal indefinitely. And then we argue for trilateral US, Russia, China agreements, non-binding initially, to prevent spillover from their competition in space and counterspace technologies into the nuclear domain. And that's what TD is going to talk about today and present one of our ideas in depth. And then in the further future, we also have a kind of vision of a comprehensive treaty-based risk reduction architecture. This point 5 is much longer term, much more ambitious, but I want to give you a flavor of that, and I will talk about one of those specific measures today. Before I hand over to TD to talk about the details of one of our proposals that's related to the space nuclear nexus, I want to talk briefly about the politics of arms control. And I think one has to start off by acknowledging that right now in the current political environment, arms control is challenging. The US and the Soviet Union managed to some extent to insulate progress on arms control from other areas, but that to some extent doesn't mean entirely by any means. And as the US-Russia and US-Chinese relationships decline, as there's the potential for conflict over Ukraine and Taiwan, we recognize you cannot isolate arms control from any of this. China's refusal to even talk about nuclear arms control, let alone reach agreement, but is clearly a challenge. Russia's treaty violations are a challenge, as I would argue is the US tendency to abrogate treaty and agreements. And domestic politics here, that means it's essentially impossible to for the Senate to ratify an arms control treaty that could be reached by a democratic administration. There is a glimmer of hope with Russia. Russia, in a real change in policy, has stated that it is interested in politically binding measures. That is a change for Russia, and I think potentially a significant one. And we are actually talking to the Russians in the strategic security dialogue, which is a good sign. To the extent that there is a way of breaking through this political impasse, it has to be a focus on creating mutual interest. And that's easy to say and quite hard to do. Almost every arms control measure that we can imagine, even if its terms are entirely reciprocal, is more beneficial to one side than the other. You know, if you focus on non-strategic nuclear weapons, that is something the US is concerned about. It's not something that Russia is particularly concerned about. So even though our proposal on non-strategic nuclear weapons is entirely reciprocal in its obligations, it favors US interests more than Russian interests. The same thing is true in reverse with ballistic missile defense. It is an issue that Russia worries about more than the US, at least for the time being. And Russian interests, you know, and so any measure that addresses Russian concerns, even if it's narrowly reciprocal in its terms, is going to favor Russia more than the US. We think the way forward here is to try to negotiate packages of measures, to combine a measure on ballistic missile defense, say, with one on non-strategic nuclear weapons. China is a particularly challenging case here because China has never really told us what it might even want from arms control if it wanted something at all. Now, kind of morally, as it were, I think China has an obligation to start thinking about what it wants in return for the things that the US wants, limits on China's forces in some way or another. As a practical matter, though, the US is the one that wants arms control with China. So I think, practically, if we want China to engage, we are the ones that are going to have to think about not just about what we want from China, but about what we might be willing to give up in return if China were willing to give us what we wanted. So let me conclude the introductory section here. I hand over to TD to talk about one of our measures relating to space, and then I will talk about one of our measures, long-term treaty-based measures relating to launcher limitations. TD.
Great, thanks. And appreciate the opportunity to talk here. So today I'm going to talk about one of the proposals from a report that looks at an issue. As James mentioned, it's at the intersection of the space and nuclear domains. It's a proposal to protect nuclear command and control satellites in high altitude orbits from anti-satellite weapons utilizing keep out zones. So many of the command and control and dual use satellites are located in high altitude orbits. And I'm just as a note, I mean dual use in the sense as nuclear and conventional, rather than the military, non-military that sometimes gets used or often gets used in the space world. So just as a refresher, my very not to scale cartoon here. So geosynchronous and geostationary orbits are at about 36,000 kilometers. This means their orbit has the same period as the Earth's rotation. So they'll sort of stay in the same point of the sky throughout the day. This provides persistent access to areas, especially around the equator, making them good for communications and early warning. So many US dual-use communication satellites are here, as are some parts of the SBIRS early warning infrared system. Russia also has some communications and imaging satellites in GEO, and China also has a small number of communications as well as a larger number of their Beidou GNSS satellites in GEO. The downside of GEO, though, is that it has poor access to the higher latitudes, such as where Russia is situated. So an alternative high altitude orbit would be a highly elliptical one, such as the Molniya orbit. These can give persistent coverage at higher latitudes using a few satellites in conjunction. So Russia has their early warning system in these Molniya orbits, in addition to some communication satellites, and the US also utilizes these orbits for part of their SBIRS architecture. So all of these orbits are at, as the name would suggest, very high altitude. So around 36,000 kilometers for GEO, and the apogee of Molniya orbits can exceed 40,000 kilometers. So they're very difficult to attack with ground-based anti-satellite weapons. So this would be something like the Noodle system that was just tested by Russia recently. And this is just because they're so far away. It takes a long time to get a missile there, and if you're using something like a ground-based directed energy weapon, there's just a lot of energy loss from the solid angle. Yeah, it's just very far away, so it's hard to deliver your weapons there. So a way around this is use co-orbital anti-satellite weapons, and these are sometimes called space mines. So these are anti-satellite weapons that essentially get launched into and live in the same orbits as their targets, and then they are later activated, and then will closely approach their targets and damage them in some way, whether that be through physical collision or utilizing an onboard weapon. So these types of weapons create a vulnerability for nuclear command and control, as they offer a way to really degrade or disable those systems, essentially in advance of a counterforce attack or something to that effect. Furthermore, since many of the same satellites are dual-use nuclear conventional, there is an incentive to attack them, say, in a conventional conflict, in order to degrade conventional capability. And the country whose satellites are being attacked may not be able to distinguish if the attack is meant to degrade their conventional capability, their conventional warfighting, or if it's marking the beginning of nuclear escalation. And then additionally, there is routine repositioning of satellites in GEO, well, in all orbits, but in GEO in particular, it can bring satellites within close proximity of one another. So if this occurs during a period of heightened tensions, it could be misinterpreted as an attack. And there's currently no obligation to notify of these maneuvers in advance. So it creates an opportunity for unintentional escalation, or a country to perceive that they're being attacked when they might not be. And these two scenarios both provide paths for unintentional nuclear escalation that we'd like to see mitigated. So our solution is for the US and Russia and China to mutually agree not to maneuver their satellites within 700 kilometers of each other's satellites in these high altitude orbits, forming what are typically referred to as keep-out zones around each satellite. Routine repositioning would be allowed, allowing one state to move a satellite through another's satellite keep-out zone, but it would require advanced notification and only be done one satellite at a time, so it would not be a useful cover for a large coordinated attack. And just as a clarification, the keep-out zone term comes with baggage. We utilize it because it's very evocative and really gets across how it works. But the sort of traditional conception of it has run into issues with the Outer Space Treaty, where it might violate the non-appropriation part of it. So in our case, we seek to skirt around that by having this apply only to the three parties, Russia, China, US, and it's just a mutual agreement between the three of them not to maneuver within the keep-out zones of the others. It would not apply to third parties or other countries or their satellites. So the benefits of keep-out zones are twofold. First, they significantly reduce the opportunity for routine repositioning to be misinterpreted as an attack, as these maneuvers would all be notified in advance. And secondly, in the event of an intentional attack, it would provide some amount of time where the attack could be detected by space domain awareness capabilities. While it can't necessarily be assured that any attack would be detected 100% of the time, and we'll come to that in a second, it would provide an opportunity for detection that would instill some uncertainty in the attacker, potentially deterring the attack. Or also, if there is a real opportunity for detection that could be used to trigger countermeasures, evasive action, what have you. It would also raise the technological barrier up for orbital anti-satellite weapons, such that smaller, less capable weapons would not be able to breach these zones without detection. So we chose 700 kilometers as the size of the keep-out zone, which is 1 degree in true anomaly, give or take, as it is large enough to provide an appreciable amount of warning time, while small enough as to limit the disruption of day-to-day activities in those orbits. And what determines what is enough warning time will depend on the space domain awareness capabilities of each party. The more often they're able to view the satellites in those orbits, the more difficult it will be to breach them without detection. So before I trade things off to James, I wanted to sort of give you an idea of sort of how we came to the 700 kilometers and what is the sort of the trade-offs involved with designing and choosing keep-out zones. That is the same thing that the participants would also need to decide on. So James, if you can skip one ahead. All right, so we'll start with the two satellites in the same orbit. We have an attacking satellite, which is our anti-satellite weapon, and our target satellite. So this is shown in elliptical orbit, but this would also apply just the same in circular geo orbits. So for satellites, for one to catch another one, you can't just simply speed up or slow down because this will move you into a different orbit. So the way you normally have to basically catch something or fall back to let something catch you is you move into a different orbit that's either faster or slower or has a shorter or longer period than the one you're in, and then allow the sort of phase of the two satellites to align, and then you move back. The sort of fuel efficient ways of doing this are relatively slow. So these would be something like Hohmann transfers or just moving when you're at your apogee or your perigee, moving into a lower or faster orbit. But those things operate on the timescales of the period of the orbit, which in this case is 24 hours. But it's not safe to assume that a co-orbital weapon will be trying to optimize for fuel efficiency because it might be a one-way trip. So we need to consider what are called direct intercepts. So James, if you can skip forward one more. So in a direct intercept, you basically move on to a different trajectory that will bring you to an intercept point at the same time that the target satellite is reaching that same intercept point. These are faster than something like a Hohmann transfer or rephasing maneuver, but it comes at the cost of much more demanding fuel consumption. So James, if you want to skip to the next one. So that means for basically every size of a keep-out zone, there's going to be a trade-off between the amount of fuel consumed and how long it takes to cross that zone. So the chart on the left shows the fuel consumption, the delta V, on the y-axis. The x-axis shows you the amount of time it takes to cross that keep out zone. And then the 4 curves show different sizes of keep out zones in true anomaly, degrees true anomaly in geo. So if any of you are colorblind and can't read the legend, it's monotonically increasing. So the smallest keep out zone of 0.5 degrees is the fastest to cross, unsurprisingly, and the largest keep out zone would be the slowest to cross and take the most fuel. So you want to basically design your keep out zone, pick the size that is going to have the most demanding delta V versus time curve. And the time you're going to want to choose such that your space domain awareness capabilities are able to observe your satellites at approximately that cadence, so that you have a high probability of detecting the satellite after it has, or the attacking weapon, after it has breached the keep out zone, but before it has reached the target. To balance this, you need to basically, from that perspective, the huge keep out zones are most beneficial because they provide the most warning time. But of course, the bigger the keep out zones, the more disruptive they are. So the table on the right shows, as of last year when we wrote the report, or this part of the report, the number of pairs of satellites or clusters of satellites that would need to be moved or resolved between the 3 parties as a function of the size of the keep out zone. So we settled on 1 degree keep out zones because it has relatively few conflicting numbers of satellites that would need to be resolved, while still providing a reasonable amount of time given some amount of delta V available to the attacking satellite. And one more thing I'll also mention quickly is that if you're attempting to clandestinely or sneak up on a satellite, damage it, and then sneak away without detection, you would basically need to do this direct intercept maneuver twice. So it would double the amount of time, double the amount of fuel, as is shown in this table here. So just to summarize, before I hand off to James, keep out zones would reduce the risks of accidental escalation. They would provide the opportunity for detecting an attack. And they'd also have indirect benefits in both establishing some rules of the road in space, albeit with just the subset of actors, Russia, China, and the US. And it would also be an opportunity to bring China to the table. As James mentioned, this measure more serves the interests of the US than the others, so it would need to be packaged with another measure in order to make it politically viable. And I'll pass it over to James in case he has anything to add, and also to discuss the launcher proposal.
That's great. Thanks, TJ. Let me talk about one final idea before we have a discussion that I'm very much looking forward to. And this is very much in the category of long-term ambitious ideas. To give you, I think it's actually helpful to explain where this proposal originated. And it was after the collapse of the INF Treaty. My colleague Tong Zhao in Beijing made this observation that one of the concerns the US had about the INF Treaty beyond Russian non-compliance was the fact that China was not a party to it, and China had a very large force of regional missiles. And so one of the points that Tong made was that China has this large force of regional missiles, but a much smaller force of strategic missiles, whereas the US has a big force of strategic missiles and a much smaller force of non-strategic systems. So Tong's suggestion was, well, why not have a limit between the US, Russia, and China on all of the systems that were previously prohibited by the INF Treaty and today are limited by New START? And so we basically ran with that idea of kind of combining INF and New START and trilateralizing it. And I think that Tong's idea, we had to make some adaptations to that idea. This is not quite as simple as just combining INF and New START, but it starts with that as its basis. I should say, I don't view this as an alternative to New START or as a US-Russia successor, but as a complement. So the proposal that we have here is that we have a single limit on various different types of missile launchers and aircraft. And I should say, one of the reasons I don't do this as an alternative to New START is because New START also limits delivery vehicles and warheads, which we do not under this treaty. But this is a trilateral treaty, US, Russia, China proposal that would limit a single limit on 3 different categories of systems. The first are launchers for ground-launched cruise missiles, ground-launched ballistic missiles, and ground-launched boost glide missiles, with ranges of more than 475 kilometers. This is very much like INF in that you're limiting launchers with ranges longer than 500 kilometers. We've added in ground-launched boost glide missiles to this system. As many of you will know, the limit in INF was 500 kilometers. Why did we choose 475 for this? Well, the reason is because of Russia's 9M729 missile, the one that violated the INF treaty. Russia has not acknowledged its missile violated the treaty. It said publicly that it has a range of 480 kilometers. We think Russia is unlikely to acknowledge that 9M729 violated the INF treaty, though apparently they did discuss this the other day in the SSD, so I'm interested to see what comes out of that. But we felt the simplest face-saving solution here was just to limit missile launchers for missiles with ranges greater than 475 kilometers. So that would, the 9M729 would be included in this limit without Russia having to acknowledge it violated the INF treaty. This limit on launchers would also limit all ICBM launchers, fixed or mobile, because ICBMs have ranges longer than 575 kilometers. This treaty would also limit all launches of sea-launched ballistic missiles, as New START does. And we would also limit all bombers with ranges greater than 2,000 kilometers. This includes the heavy bombers that are limited under New START, but would also include medium bombers like Russia's backfire bomber. And we don't know whether China's bombers meet the New START definition, but they would certainly meet the definition of a bomber with a range greater than 2,000 kilometers. In implementing these limits, there would be this kind of core political compromise the two sides would make. The US would make a major concession to Russia and China by acknowledging, for the purposes of treaty implementation, treating Aegis Ashore launchers as ground-launched cruise missiles. As ground-launched cruise missile launchers. So each one of the Aegis Ashore launchers would be counted under this limit. In a major reciprocal concession, Russia and China would agree that the scope of this agreement did not include sea-launched cruise missiles or sea-launched boost glide missiles. Sea-launched cruise missiles being a current area of advantage and sea-launched boost glide missiles being an area of major US interest. And unlike New START, there's almost no conversions or exemptions permitted. All US bombers, B-2, B-1, B-1B, B-52, would count under this agreement. The backfire would count under this agreement. Verified dismantlement would be allowed, but no conversions or exemptions. There's very limited exceptions, which I won't go into now. Now, one of the reasons we focus on launchers as opposed to missiles or warheads is because it makes verification a lot easier, though not easy. Our verification regime involves a comprehensive data exchange, national technical means, and on-site inspections for mobile accountable launchers. Everything else we think you can do via NTM, but mobile launchers you would need to do with on-site inspections. And one of the advantages of this definition is because if you look at the number of accountable launchers and accountable bombers under our definitions that each state has, right now they're roughly equal. Emphasis on the word roughly. I mean, we believe we know the exact number currently in the US, which is 986. China appears to have about 1,000. The number for Russia is actually much more uncertain. It's at least 800, but I think it may be significantly more than 800 because of various Russian systems we have very, very little fidelity with in the open source on numbers. And I think there's reason to think that this rough equality in numbers may be maintained over the next however many years. A whole bunch of US launchers are going to become accountable under our definitions, the HIMARS launchers, when they're used to launch a ground-launched ballistic missile with a range greater than 500 kilometers. And a whole extra number of Chinese silos are going to become accountable once they're completed. So, we think the current, and there's also reasons to think that Russia is going to churn out a bunch more of its cruise missile launchers. So, this rough equality may be maintained. And in fact, we wouldn't propose using this treaty to do reductions specifically. The main value of this treaty is, in my mind, to help stabilize this complex three-way arms race. So, personally, I would support limits that were pretty close to the country's holdings at the time of entry into force. We think this kind of agreement would also help to mitigate escalation risks, since a number of particularly concerning threatening capabilities that could threaten nuclear command and control or leadership would be constrained. It goes without saying, this is clearly a long-term challenging goal. Major compromises would be required from all parties. We think there is reciprocity in all of these compromises. But, the US willingness and the Russian and the Chinese willingness to count Aegis ashore, but not any sea-based missiles other than sea-launched ballistic missiles, remains to be tested. This agreement would require a radical increase in transparency from China. Never mind the on-site inspections, even the declarations would be a much, much greater transparency about systems than China has ever accepted before. I think there's also a question for the US, which is whether we can accept this kind of equality in terms of having a treaty that enshrines us having equal numbers as Russia and China. Part of the argument, I think, against this kind of proposal would be that right now China has a much larger force of regional missiles than the United States. And so the United States should build up its force of regional missiles before agreeing to an agreement. Now, I think to some extent, further buildups are inevitable. I mean, even under the best case, this kind of an agreement is going to take a long time to mature and be negotiated and come to fruition. And some kind of buildup then I think is inevitable. But obviously, to the extent that there is a US buildup and that catalyzes a countervailing Chinese and or Russian buildup, I think it makes negotiating limitations harder. And I think the question for the US is really, how do the risks of trying to compete in a two-way arms race outweigh the risks of accepting equality? One challenge I would point out from the US perspective is that deploying at all, I think, but certainly in large numbers, ground-launched missiles to allies, especially in Asia, I think is going to be very challenging. I think there are a lot of allies that don't want those deployments and whose populations would be deeply hostile to those deployments, even of conventional missiles, let alone nuclear missiles. And so, I think there is a risk from a US perspective of us not supporting arms control, even if Russia and China would, which is obviously deeply uncertain, but of us not supporting arms control, trying to compete and failing to compete because allies won't take these kind of missiles that we want to put on their territory. And so I think from a US perspective, one can't, in assessing the desirability of this proposal, one shouldn't just look at the value to deployments for us of further missile deployments for us to allied territory. If allies accepted them and they were successful, we also have to look at the risk that we try to deploy those kind of missiles and actually fail to do so. So let me leave that there. As I say in the report, there is, between the report that TD&I just published and one in 2020 on the future of New START, there's 10 different proposals there. We've only highlighted 2 today, but very happy both to take questions and hear your thoughts both about these 2 proposals, but also about any of the other issues or aspects that this report covers. So very much looking forward to the discussion, and let me hand over to Brad to moderate.
James, TD, thanks very much for an excellent start to the discussion.